They took the North 81st, then the equipment shed. Then, on a cold Tuesday in October, my father set his coffee down on a truck tailgate. He told me I didn't deserve a single acre of the family farm. He laughed when he said it. Not a cruel laugh, he'd have told you, just a tired one, like a man setting down a bag he'd carried too far. My sister's name was already on the new deed. Mine wasn't anywhere. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I picked up my clipboard. I went back to work. Here's what my father didn't know that morning. Standing in the gravel, coffee steaming, breath fogging. The deed he'd just signed wasn't the only deed to that ground. There was an older one, filed years before in a quiet office downtown, by a man who saw this exact morning coming before I ever could. And he'd left me one thing because of it. Sealed. Not opened in 4 years. 3 months later, a bank attorney in Muncie would read a name off a page. He'd go quiet in the middle of a sentence. My father would be looking right at me when it happened. He still wouldn't understand. But before any of that, there was the gravel, and the coffee, and the laugh. My name is Dana Holloway. I was 31 that fall. I'd kept the books for the family farm 10 years. Every grain ticket, every propane bill, every dollar that came in or went out of 200 acres on Reedy Fork Road, Delaware County, Indiana. I did not raise my voice that morning. I did not need to. I turned around. I walked back to the office off the machine shed. There was a grain settlement on the desk I hadn't finished, and crying in front of my father had stopped doing anything for me a long time ago. The settlement was from the Tuesday before, last load of beans hauled to the co-op. The check they'd cut said one number. My ledger said another, $312 apart. Most people would have signed it, never noticed the hole. I ran it back through the moisture discount, found where they'd docked us twice on the same ticket. I circled the number, initialed the margin in pencil, the way I always did. $312. I don't get loud, I get it recorded. That was the kind of thing I was good at. Not loud, not flashy, just careful. 10 years of careful, on a farm that never once said thank you for it. My mother died when I was 19. After that, it was my father, my sister Lindsay, and me. Lindsay left for Indianapolis at 20. She came back only for holidays and money. I stayed. I learned the co-op's discount schedule better than the co-op did. I learned which banker in Muncie actually read the numbers, and which one just signed where you told him to. I ran the diesel account so tight, my father used to joke, I could squeeze a nickel until Jefferson cried. He wasn't joking anymore by that October. He hadn't joked about much in 2 years. Not since the second bad harvest in a row. Not since the note at the bank started keeping him up nights he thought I didn't notice. I noticed everything. That was the job. The house sat at the end of Reedy Fork Road, red brick going soft at the corners, a leaning barn out back my grandfather built with 2 other men, and a case of nails, back in 1961. Everyone around Stony Creek just called it the Holloway place, sometimes the Holloway Bottoms for the low ground along the creek. It flooded some springs. It grew the best corn in the township the years it didn't. My grandfather, Earl Holloway, farmed that ground until his hands gave out. He died when I was 23. I still had his coffee tin in my kitchen, dented on one side. A few bent nails rattling in the bottom that nobody ever bothered to throw away. He taught me to read a ledger before I could read a novel. He used to say the dirt remembers who works it, whether or not the deed agrees. I didn't understand what he meant until years after he was gone. I understood it exactly on the day my father laughed at me in the gravel. 2 weeks before that morning, my father called a family meeting, kitchen table. Lindsay drove in from Indianapolis in a car that cost more than our tractor's last repair bill. She sat across from me in a blazer she probably paid $400 for. She didn't look at me once while our father talked. I've been thinking about the future of this place, he said, about who can actually run it going forward. I said nothing. I had a pretty good guess where this was headed. I'd already seen a folder on his desk from a title company 2 counties over. Folders like that don't show up because a man is feeling sentimental. Lindsay's got the head for the business side, he said. The banking relationships, the way things move now. Lindsay had visited the farm 4 times in 3 years. Twice for Christmas, once for my grandfather's funeral. Once because her car broke down 40 minutes from here, and this was the closest driveway. I've decided to put the deed in her name, my father said. Full transfer, clean. One name on the paper. Easier for the bank. Easier for everybody. I asked the only question that mattered. What happens to the operation? You'll still run it, he said, like that settled something. Same as always. This is just paper, Dana. Don't make it more than it is. I looked at Lindsay. She was studying her phone. It's 200 acres, I said. 160 years of family. It's not just paper. My father's jaw did the thing it does when he's decided a conversation is over before it's actually over. You don't deserve a single acre of it, he said. I remember thinking, from somewhere outside my own body, that he'd chosen those words on purpose. The way a man picks up a hammer knowing exactly what it's for. I didn't cry at that table. I finished my coffee, said I had a truck to unload. Left. The deed transfer went through 19 days later. I found out the way I found out most things in that house. Second hand. After the fact. The mail carrier handed me a copy of the recorded document addressed to my father. I opened it because I always opened the mail. That was also the job. Lindsay Ann Holloway, grantee, 200 acres more or less in Delaware County, Indiana. The same real estate conveyed to Wade Holloway by deed recorded in Deed Book 214, page 87. I read it twice at the kitchen table, then I put it back in its envelope, set it on my father's desk, exactly where I'd found it. That was also something I was good at, not reacting, not giving anyone the satisfaction. That was the morning of the tailgate. My father came out to the gravel turnaround where I always parked the grain trucks, holding his coffee, watching me check tyre pressure on the flatbed like it was any other Tuesday. I asked him, calm as I could manage, why he hadn't told me himself instead of letting me find a recorded deed in the mail. That's when he set the coffee down. That's when he said I didn't deserve a single acre. That's when he laughed. Here's the plain truth of it. I was not surprised. Hurt, yes. In a place so old and familiar, it barely registered as new pain. But not surprised. My father had been choosing Lindsay's comfort over my labour since I was old enough to notice the pattern. I had spent 10 years telling myself the work would eventually speak for itself, that if I stayed careful enough, patient enough, useful enough, the ledger would balance in my favour eventually. It did not occur to me that morning that the ledger already had, years before I understood the entry was there. What I did know, standing in that gravel with my clipboard against my chest, was this. My grandfather Earl had handed me an envelope 4 years before he died. A plain manila envelope. For the day they tell you to leave, written across the front in his blocky, careful hand. He told me to put it somewhere safe, not to open it unless I truly needed to. I asked him what was in it. He just smiled, the way he did when he thought a thing was funnier than it had any right to be. The dirt remembers who works it, he said. So will this when the time comes. I had never opened it. It sat in a fireproof box in my closet, under a stack of tax returns 4 years. I didn't open it that morning either. I finished checking the tyre pressure, drove the flatbed to the co-op, came home, made dinner for my father, because somebody had to. He ate it without a single word about the deed, as if the matter had already closed to his satisfaction, and mine simply hadn't caught up yet. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my grandfather's coffee tin in front of me, the bent nails rattling faintly when I moved it. I thought about the word he'd used. Remembers, not owns, not deserves. Remembers. I still didn't open the envelope. Not that night. But I did start driving to the county recorder's office 3 days later, on my lunch hour, telling myself it was only curiosity. Only the same careful habit that made me circle a $312 discrepancy on a grain ticket nobody else would have noticed. I had no idea, walking through those glass doors the first time, what I was about to find, sitting one page behind my father's brand new deed. Neither did he. The Delaware County Recorder's office sat on the 3rd floor of a courthouse annex downtown, past a metal detector, down a hallway that smelled like dust and old coffee, the kind of smell that clings to every room where people go looking for the truth about who owns what. I'd been in there twice before, both times for my father, pulling old plat maps for a fence dispute. This time I came for myself. The deputy recorder that Thursday was a woman named Glenda Voss. Grey hair, cut short and practical, reading glasses on a beaded chain. The kind of person who's watched families come in polite and leave furious for 30 years. She asked what I needed. I told her I wanted the chain of title on a parcel out on Reedy Fork Road. Recent transfer, she asked, already reaching for a slip. Yesterday's mail, I said. She didn't ask anything more. Glenda Voss had heard every version of this story. She had the patience of someone who knows the paper will say what it says, no matter who's standing at the counter. She pulled the current deed first. Lindsay Ann Holloway, grantee, recorded 19 days earlier. Then she walked the chain backward, deed by deed. The way water runs downhill whether you want it to or not. Deed book 214, page 87. My father's deed, the one that conveyed the land to him from his own father, dated the spring after my grandfather's hands finally gave out. There it is, Glenda said, sliding the heavy bound volume around. Wade Holloway, grantee, from Earl J. Holloway, grantor. I nodded. I already knew that much. I'd seen a copy once, folded in a drawer, helping settle the estate after my grandfather died. Want me to keep going back? Glenda asked. I said yes, mostly because I didn't know what else to say. Some instinct older than my conscious thinking told me not to stop there. She flipped forward instead of back. That confused me a second until she explained. Sometimes a grantor records more than one document around the same transaction, especially an older farmer who'd outlived 2 lawyers and trusted a third to draw up something careful. She found it on the very next page. Page 88. Recorded the same afternoon as the deed to my father. Same notary. Same witness signatures. The recorder's index called it a reservation of life estate with remainder interest. Glenda read it slowly. The way you read something once and want to be sure you read it right the first time. A mistake on a public record follows a family for generations. Your grandfather conveyed the farm to your father, she said, but he reserved himself a life estate. He kept the right to use the land and its income until his own death. She tapped the page under the legal description. And then the remainder interest, everything left over after his life estate ended, he didn't leave to your father outright. He split it. Life estate to Wade Holloway. Remainder to... She looked up over her reading glasses. Dana Margaret Holloway, she read. Granddaughter. I stood at that counter a long time. Some part of me expected to feel triumphant. I didn't. I felt like the floor had shifted an inch left. Everything on it needed re-leveling before I could trust standing on it again. What does that mean? I finally said. In practice. Glenda took her glasses off, set them on the counter, the gesture of someone about to explain something plainly, instead of in legal language. It means your grandfather never gave your father the whole farm, she said. He gave him the use of it for his lifetime. But the remainder, the ownership that survives your father's life estate, that's already yours. Has been since the day this was recorded. When was it recorded? I asked. Some part of me already knew the answer would matter more than almost anything else in this story. She turned back to the index. 11 years ago, March the 14th. 11 years. I would have been 20, my grandfather would have been 78. 2 years before his hands gave out for good. 3 years before he pressed that manila envelope into my hands and told me not to open it unless I truly needed to. The dirt remembers who works it. So will this, when the time comes. I understood, standing there with dust turning slow in the afternoon light, that my grandfather hadn't been speaking in riddles. He'd been telling me, as plainly as a careful man ever tells anyone, that the farm could never truly leave my hands, no matter what my father did with a piece of paper 19 days ago, which meant something about that deed to Lindsay, the one my father signed with such satisfaction, the one he used to tell me I didn't deserve a single acre. It was built on ground my father never fully had the right to convey. He could transfer his life estate, whatever remained of his own lifetime interest. He could not transfer what wasn't his to give. The remainder, the true underlying ownership, was already recorded in my name. 11 years before he ever sat Lindsay and me down at that kitchen table. I need copies of both of these, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Take your time, Glenda said, already moving toward the copier. Most people don't come in here looking for good news. It's nice when it happens. I stood there while the copier hummed and clicked. I thought about all the years I'd spent believing that being useful was the same thing as being secure. I thought about the $312 I caught on a grain ticket the week before. How small that felt now. Next to 200 acres my grandfather had quietly protected before I even understood there was anything to protect. I drove home that afternoon with 2 certified copies in a folder on the passenger seat. I told my father nothing. The reason matters. I could have driven straight to the house, walked in, set that folder on the kitchen table where he'd told me I didn't deserve a single acre. Some people would have. I understand the impulse, but I'd also learned, over 10 years watching my father operate, that a man who feels cornered too early digs in harder, hides what else he might be hiding, makes the reckoning messier for everyone, including me. So I went home. I opened the fireproof box in my closet, the one under the tax returns. I finally opened the manila envelope my grandfather gave me 4 years before he died. Inside was a single sheet in his handwriting, and a certified copy of the same reservation Glenda had just shown me. Folded the way he must have folded it more than a decade ago, his letter was short. My grandfather never wasted words on paper any more than he wasted them out loud. Dana, if you're reading this, someone has told you the land isn't yours. They're wrong, and the county has known it longer than they have. I did not do this because I loved you, more than your father or your sister. I did it because I watched you work that ground the way I worked it. I knew you'd still be standing on it when the rest of the noise had gone quiet. The dirt remembers who works it. Now you have the paper that says so too. Don't wave this around. Use it when you need it, and not one day before. Love, Grandpa Earl. I sat at my kitchen table a long time after I read that letter, the coffee tin in front of me, the bent nails rattling faintly whenever I shifted. I didn't cry, not really, though my eyes stung the way they do in cold wind. I felt like a question I hadn't known I was carrying had finally been answered. 11 years after the answer was written down, I still didn't know exactly when I'd use it. I only knew, with a calm that surprised even me, that I wouldn't need to raise my voice to do it. My grandfather had already done the loud part, quietly. On a Tuesday afternoon in March, 11 years before any of us knew we'd need it, what I did not yet know, sitting at that table, was how soon the need would come, or how badly my father actually needed that deed to be clean. I didn't say anything to my father for 11 days. I kept doing the books. I kept catching his small errors and fixing them without comment, the way I always had. A farm doesn't stop needing its ledger balanced just because its ownership got a lot more complicated overnight. But I watched him differently after that. I started noticing things I'd been too close to see before. My father had always been careful with the farm's paperwork, careful in the way of a man who grew up watching his own father get burned by a handshake deal on seed corn. He kept a locked drawer in the desk in the den. He kept the key on the same ring as his truck keys, which meant I saw it every single day of my life and never once thought to wonder what was inside. On a Wednesday, while he was in Muncie for what he called a bank thing, I did wonder. I am not proud of going through that drawer. I told myself for years afterward I was only trying to understand what I was dealing with. I still believe that's mostly true. But I also understood, standing there with the key in my hand, that I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. I crossed it anyway. The drawer held what you'd expect. Insurance papers. An old will that predated any of this mess. A folder of tax returns going back a decade. And underneath all of that, a loan document from Farmers and Merchants Bank of Muncie. A balloon note, the kind where you pay interest for years, then owe the whole remaining principal in one lump sum on a fixed date. The date on that balloon payment was 6 weeks away. The amount due was $410,000. I sat on the edge of his desk chair, read it twice, the way I'd read the deed twice at the kitchen table 3 weeks before. $410,000. Due in full. No extensions listed anywhere. A note that had clearly been renewed once already, 3 years back, buying time that had now run out. There was a second document clipped behind it. A loan application, dated 1 month ago, for a new refinance to cover the balloon, contingent on clear, unencumbered collateral. The exact 200 acres my father had just finished transferring into Lindsay's name. I understood, sitting in that den with a key that wasn't mine, why the deed transfer happened exactly when it happened. Why it happened all at once instead of gradually, the way estate planning usually does. My father wasn't handing Lindsay the farm out of love. He wasn't even doing it out of the plain favouritism I'd spent 10 years absorbing without complaint. He was trying to consolidate the title into one clean name, one clean borrower, so the bank would approve a refinance he desperately needed before that balloon payment took the whole operation down with it. Lindsay wasn't the favourite child in that moment. Lindsay was collateral. I put everything back exactly where I found it, but locked the drawer, put the key back on the ring before he got home. I made dinner. I said nothing, but something in me had shifted from hurt into something colder and more useful. I recognized the shift. It was the same feeling I got every time I found an error on a grain ticket everyone else had waved through. I didn't get loud, I got accurate. 2 days later, Lindsay called, which she almost never did unless she needed something. She sounded tired in a way I hadn't heard before. The particular exhaustion of someone realizing a gift has strings that reach all the way to the ceiling. "Dad's been weird lately," she said. "He keeps asking me to sign things. He wants me at the bank Friday for something about the loan. Did he tell you what it's for?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "Something about refinancing," she said. "I don't really understand the financial stuff." "That's more your thing." I almost laughed at that, though nothing about it was funny. My whole life I'd been the one who understood the financial stuff, the one who caught the $312 discrepancies. And my father had never once thought to loop me in. Not on a decision that put my own legal interest directly in the path of a bank's collateral requirement. He probably never even read that far back in his own deed. Most people don't. Most people trust the last transaction is the only one that matters. "When's the closing?" I asked Lindsay. He said 3 weeks, maybe 4. I did the math without a calculator. 6 weeks to the balloon deadline, 3 or 4 weeks to closing. Just enough runway if nothing went wrong. "Lindsay," I said, "has anybody told you the land wasn't fully Dad's to give you? That Grandpa split the interest before he died?" There was a long pause on the line. "What are you talking about?" I almost told her everything right there. I want you to understand how close I came. I think it says something about who I actually am. Underneath the calm restraint everyone in my family had trained themselves to read as coldness. I loved my sister, even after everything. I didn't want her standing at a closing table, signing her name to something doomed. Not the moment somebody actually read the county record, but I also knew, with a certainty that felt almost physical, that warning her now meant she'd run straight to my father. And my father would spend the next 3 weeks trying to find some way around the recorded interest, instead of walking into that bank unprepared. Careful people, I'd learned from 10 years watching him operate. Only stay careful when they don't know they need to be. "It's complicated," I told her instead. "Ask Dad to show you the original deed from Grandpa sometime. The whole thing, not just the part he told you about." She said she would. I doubted she actually would. Lindsay had spent her whole adult life letting other people manage the parts of the world she found inconvenient. I understood, hanging up that phone, that this quality in her wasn't cruelty. It was a kind of learned helplessness our father had cultivated in her, the same way he'd cultivated capability in me. Neither of us had really chosen our role. We'd just been cast so early, it felt like personality instead of assignment. That night I took the 2 certified copies out of the fireproof box again. Alongside my grandfather's letter, I laid them on my kitchen table under the light, read them both one more time. I thought about my calm mantra, the one I'd been saying to myself without quite realizing it was becoming one. I don't get loud, I get it recorded. I thought about what it would mean to let this play out at the bank's closing table, instead of stopping it quietly beforehand. A part of me, the part that still loved my sister and didn't want to watch her humiliated, wanted to intervene early, spare everyone the public reckoning. But a colder, steadier part of me, the part my grandfather had apparently been counting on for 11 years, understood something else. Some lessons only take when they're witnessed by the people who need to learn them, in a room they can't simply leave. I decided, sitting at that table with the coffee tin rattling faintly under my hand, that I would let the closing happen. I would let my father walk in and pledge 200 acres of collateral he didn't have the legal right to pledge. I would let the bank's own attorney be the one to discover it. A discovery made by a stranger carries a different weight. It lands harder than an accusation from a daughter who's been counting the ways she's been wronged. I did not yet know exactly how I would arrange for that discovery to happen at the right moment, in front of the right people. I only knew I had 6 weeks, a folder of certified documents, a grandfather's letter telling me not to wave any of it around until I truly needed to. I was starting to understand, for the first time in my life, that I truly needed to. The person I finally told was Ruth Anders. Ruth ran the feed store in Stony Creek, had run it since before I was born. She'd known my grandfather well enough to still call him Earl, 30 years after everyone else switched to formality out of respect for his age. She was somewhere past 70 herself by then, still working the counter 3 days a week because she said. Retirement bored her worse than arthritis did. I'd known Ruth my whole life, the way you know the furniture of a small town. Present, steady, easy to take for granted. It wasn't until that October I understood how much she'd actually been paying attention to my family. I went to the feed store on a Saturday for fencing wire. I ended up standing at her counter 40 minutes, telling her almost everything. Ruth had a way of asking one plain question, then simply waiting, patient as a fence post, until you filled the silence yourself. Your grandpa came in here the week he filed that paper, she said. Once I told her about the life estate and the remainder interest, didn't tell me what he'd done, just said he'd finally sorted something out that had been sitting wrong with him a long while. I asked him what. He said, ask me again in 20 years. Did he say anything else? I asked. He said, your daddy was a good man, Ruth said. Matter of fact. The way she'd tell you the price of a £50 bag of feed. Said Wade never quite learned the difference between loving somebody and needing somebody to need him. Said he worried Wade would lean on whichever kid let him lean hardest. Said that leaning would eventually cost that kid everything, unless somebody built a floor under her first. I stood there with a coil of fencing wire in my hand. Something in my chest loosened, like a knot loosening once you find the right end to pull. He built the floor, I said. Sounds like he did, Ruth said. Question is what you're going to do standing on it. I told her my plan, told her or the shape of one, since I hadn't worked out every piece yet. The balloon note, the refinance, the closing coming in a few weeks. Ruth listened without interrupting. When I finished, she reached under the counter, pulled out an old ledger of her own, decades of feed and seed accounts, in a hand almost as careful as my grandfather's. Your granddad used to say something else, she said. Said the quietest people in any room are usually the ones holding the only piece of paper that matters. Said the trick was letting the loud ones talk themselves all the way to the edge before you set it down. I asked if she'd come with me when the time came. I don't know exactly why, except that I didn't want to walk into that bank alone. I trusted Ruth Anders more than almost anyone left living in my family. I'll come, she said. Somebody ought to see this through who remembers how it started. Over the next 2 weeks, I did what I do best. I got careful. I called Farmers and Merchants Bank in Muncie. Not as Wade Holloway's daughter, just as a Delaware County property owner asking about the recording status on a piece of real estate. It took 2 calls and 1 visit in person. But I finally spoke with a loan officer named Patricia Renfro. She confirmed it in the careful non-committal language bankers use when a question is bigger than it sounds. A refinance application was pending on a Reedy Fork Road parcel. Contingent on clear title. I didn't tell her what I knew, I only asked one question, i.e., what happens if title isn't clear at closing? Then closing doesn't happen, she said. We can't fund against collateral, we can't verify. I thanked her and hung up. I understood I had exactly the leverage I needed, exactly the patience my grandfather had spent 11 years betting I would develop. 3 days after that call, my father invited me to dinner. Unusual enough that I should have known something was coming. He cooked, which was rarer still, a pot roast that had clearly taken most of the afternoon. He poured 2 glasses of the good bourbon he usually saved for holidays. I want us to be all right, Dana, he said partway through the meal, not quite looking at me. I know the deed thing hurt you. I didn't do it to hurt you. I know, I said, and meant it, because I did understand by then exactly why he'd done it. Understanding a person's motive isn't the same as forgiving the damage it causes. The bank needs the refinance clean, he said. I need you to keep doing what you do, keep the books tight through the closing. After that, everything settles down. I promise you that. I asked him, casual as I could manage, whether he'd ever gone back and read his own father's original deed in full, start to finish. Not just the summary the title company gave him years ago. He looked at me strangely. Why would I need to do that? I've had that deed 30 years. Just curious, I said, took a bite of pot roast. Let the silence sit there the way Ruth Anders let silences sit at her counter. My father filled it, the way people usually do when a silence starts to feel like a held breath. Your grandfather was sentimental in his last years, he said. Talked in circles sometimes. I always figured whatever paperwork he left was just him wanting to feel useful before he passed. I thought about the words on that page in the recorder's office. Reservation of life estate with remainder interest. I thought about how sentimental circles was exactly the wrong description for a document that precise. Filed with exactly the right notary, exactly the right witnesses. 11 years before anyone needed it read aloud. Grandpa wasn't sentimental, I said. He was careful. There's a difference. My father's eyes narrowed slightly. The look he gets when he suspects a conversation is carrying more weight than its words admit to. What's that supposed to mean? I could have told him everything right there over pot roast and good bourbon. In the privacy of our own kitchen, where no bank attorney or county clerk would ever witness it. Some nights, thinking back, I believe that would have been the kinder thing to do. But I also believe, and believed even then, something else. My father had spent 30 years assuming his own comfort would always be arranged by someone more careful than he was. The only lesson that would actually stick was one delivered in a room he couldn't simply argue his way out of. Not a private word over dinner. Nothing, I said. Just proud of him, that's all. He always thought about the long run. My father relaxed, mistaking my meaning for something softer than it was. He refilled his glass. Told me a story about my grandfather I'd heard a dozen times. About the year of the flood. Earl Holloway walking the bottoms in hip waders, checking on cattle nobody thought could be saved. I let him tell it. I even laughed in the right places. Underneath the laughing, the cold, steady thing that had been building in me for weeks settled into something closer to certainty than anger. 2 days before the scheduled closing, Ruth Anders called me at the farm office. Went by the bank on an errand, she said. Ran into your daddy in the parking lot. Looked like a man carrying something heavy uphill. Asked after you kind and all, but there was worry in it, Dana. Real worry. He should be worried, I said. You still planning what we talked about? I am. Good, Ruth said. Because I called the closing officer's office myself this morning. Told them I was a long-time friend of the family with information relevant to the title. Asked to be present. They said as long as I wasn't a party to the loan, I was welcome to sit in the waiting area. I intend to do more than sit. I laughed. My first real laugh in weeks. Ruth Anders, are you planning on causing a scene at my father's bank? I'm planning on being present when the truth gets read out loud, she said. What happens after that is between your family and the paper your grandfather left. I'm just there to remember it. That night, I gathered everything into one folder. The certified copy of the reservation, the certified copy of my father's original deed, my grandfather's letter, which I almost left out. At the last minute, I decided some part of this needed to be about more than winning. I wanted the truth on that table to be my grandfather's truth, not just a legal technicality I happened to exploit. I did not sleep well that night either. It's one thing to plan a quiet reckoning at a kitchen table, alone, with only your own conscience for company. It's another thing entirely to know that in 48 hours, you'll watch your father's face change in front of strangers. No amount of careful preparation entirely prepares you for wanting, at the very last second, to simply hand him a private warning instead. I did not call him. I packed the folder into my bag, set my alarm, lay awake a long time listening to the house settle around me. The same house my grandfather had raised my father in. The same house my father had, in his own clumsy and frightened way, been trying to save. I thought I understood the whole shape of it by then. The balloon note, the refinance, the deed built to make collateral look clean. I was wrong. The second piece came from a place I never expected. 9 days before the scheduled closing, I got a call from a man named Curtis Beale. He ran the grain elevator 2 towns over, in Selma. A squat operation my father used when the Stony Creek Co-op storage ran full during harvest. I'd met Curtis maybe a dozen times, always briefly, always about weights and moisture and settlement checks. Dana, he said, I probably shouldn't be calling you about this, but your name's the one on the file, so I figure you're who I'm supposed to talk to. What file? I asked. Your daddy signed a forward contract with us back in July, Curtis said. Sold next year's corn crop off 200 acres. Locked in at $4.10 a bushel. Took an advance payment against it. $60,000, paid out in August. I sat very still at my desk, phone against my ear, doing arithmetic I didn't want to be doing. 200 acres of what corn, I said. Whose corn? Says right here, Curtis said. I could hear paper shuffling on his end. Wade Holloway, on behalf of the Holloway Farm, Reedy Fork Road parcel. Advance already dispersed to an account ending in 4112. Curtis, I said, That contract commits next year's crop off land that isn't fully my father's to commit. Not anymore. Maybe not for 11 years, if we're being honest. There was a pause on his end, the particular silence of a man realizing he'd stepped into something bigger than a weights and measures phone call. "I'm not following you," he said. I explained it plainly. The life estate, the remainder, interest, the deed to Lindsay that only transferred what my father actually had the right to transfer. Curtis listened without interrupting. When I finished, he let out a long breath. "Well," he said, "that's a problem then. Because that $60,000 is already spent. Wade told us it was going toward inputs for next season. Seed, fertilizer, that kind of thing." "Is it?" I asked. "Ma'am," Curtis said, careful now, "I only track grain. I don't track bank accounts. But I'll tell you this much. That contract's got your father's signature alone on it. If the interest in that land isn't clean the way he told us, we've got ourselves a problem. A contract built on nothing." I thanked Curtis. I sat at my desk a long time after I hung up, turning the new piece over, the way you turn over a rock to see what's living underneath. I had assumed, walking out of the recorder's office 3 weeks earlier, that the danger began and ended with the balloon note and the refinance. I hadn't accounted for the possibility he'd already been spending money against collateral he didn't fully own, quietly, months before any of the deed drama with Lindsay even started. $60,000 already gone, tied to a crop that hadn't been planted yet, off land where his actual ownership was only a life estate, one the remainder holder could challenge the moment she decided to make noise about it. I was the remainder holder. I hadn't decided to make any noise at all. That evening my father came by my house, which he almost never did, carrying a bag of tomatoes from his garden, like an offering. The closest thing to an apology gesture I had ever seen from him without an actual apology attached. "I heard you talk to Curtis Beale," he said, standing in my kitchen doorway, not quite coming in. I did. "It's not what it sounds like," he said. "The advance was a bridge. I was going to pay it back out of the refinance proceeds, roll it into the new note. Nobody was ever going to be hurt by it." "Somebody's already been hurt by it," I said. "You spent $60,000 against a crop off land you only own a life estate in. If the closing doesn't happen the way you're expecting, that contract's sitting on nothing." My father set the tomatoes down on the counter. Slow. The gesture of a man buying himself a few seconds to think. "The closing's happening in 9 days," he said. "It'll be fine." "Is it going to be fine, Dad?" I asked. "Or are you just hoping it will be, the same way you hoped the balloon note would sort itself out the last 3 years?" He didn't answer that. He looked older, standing in my kitchen doorway, than he'd looked at the family meeting 6 weeks earlier, older than the tailgate morning, older even than I remembered him at my grandfather's funeral. I understood, watching him, that the fear I'd found in that desk drawer had been eating at him far longer than I'd realised, long enough to make a normally careful man reckless. "I never wanted any of this to touch you and Lindsay," he said finally. "I thought if I moved fast enough, quiet enough, you two would never even have to know how close things got." "I've known how close things got for 3 weeks, I said. "I've had a folder in my closet the whole time that says the closing isn't going to go the way you think it is." He looked at me sharply. "What do you mean?" I almost told him right there in my own kitchen, with a bag of his tomatoes between us. I came close a second time, but I thought about Curtis Beale's $60,000, already spent, already gone. I understood that a private warning now would only give my father time to find some new, more desperate manoeuvre. "Some structures," my grandfather used to say, "you can't shore up. You can only clear the people out before they come down." "You'll see when we get there," I said. "I think it's better if I show you instead of telling you tonight." He left without the tomatoes, forgetting them on my counter. I stood in my kitchen a long time afterward, looking at that bag, thinking about how a man careful with fence lines his whole life had let fear make him careless. Careless with the one thing supposed to outlast all of it. 2 days later, Ruth Anders called with something I hadn't expected either. "Went digging a little myself," she said, "since I had the time and the curiosity. Called an old friend still working the assessor's office. Your daddy's had that grain contract flagged internally a month already. Somebody at the county noticed the acreage didn't match clean with current ownership once your remainder interest search started pinging the system. Word travels slow in a place this size, Dana." "But it travels," Meaning what? I asked. Meaning the bank's title company may already know more than they're letting on before that closing, Ruth said. Meaning you might not even need to be the one to say it out loud. Meaning it might already be too late for anybody to stop what's coming, however it comes. I thought about that for the rest of the week, whether the reckoning I'd been quietly building toward had already started moving on its own. I decided it didn't change my plan either way. I would still be in that room. I would still have the folder. Whether the truth arrived through my own hand or through the slow grinding machinery of county records catching up to itself. Either way, I intended to be standing there when it landed, the way my grandfather had clearly intended. 11 years before either of us knew exactly which morning it would be, Lindsay showed up at my house 4 days before the closing. No warning. Her car crunching up the gravel drive at 9 at night, the way it hadn't in years. I let her in. She stood in my kitchen the way our father had stood in the doorway days before, not quite committing to sitting down, arms crossed against a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I asked Dad to show me the deed, she said. The whole thing, like you told me to. He kept changing the subject. Finally, I just pulled the copy myself off the file cabinet in his office. And, I said, though I already knew what she must have found. There's a second page, she said. Page 88. I don't fully understand what it says, but I understand the word remainder, and I understand it's got your name on it, not mine. I pulled a chair out for her. This time she sat. I've known for 3 weeks, I said. I found it at the recorder's office. Grandpa filed it 11 years ago. Lindsay was quiet a long moment, turning a coffee mug I'd set in front of her in slow circles, not drinking from it. Why didn't you tell me? She finally asked. There was less accusation in it than I expected. More flat exhaustion. Someone realizing they'd been standing on ground that was never actually solid. Because I didn't know how to tell you without it going straight back to Dad, I said, and I needed him to hear it in a room he couldn't argue his way out of. That's not an excuse, it's just the truth. You could have saved me from signing anything, she said. I put my name on a loan application for land that isn't even mine. I know, I said. I've thought about that every day since I found it. I decided protecting you from an uncomfortable morning mattered less than making sure Dad finally understood what he was standing on. I'm not going to pretend that was an easy call, Lindsay. It wasn't. She looked at me across the table. For the first time in longer than either of us could probably measure, I saw something in her expression that wasn't performance. Wasn't the practiced ease she'd worn at every family gathering for a decade. Just tired, plain honesty. Dad's been different for months, she said. I thought it was just stress about the harvest. I didn't know it was this bad. It's this bad, I said. $60,000 already spent against a crop on land he only holds a life estate in. A balloon note coming due in a month. A refinance that isn't going to close because the collateral he's pledging was never fully his to pledge. So what happens to him? Lindsay asked. If the refinance doesn't go through. I didn't have a clean answer for that. I told her so. I don't know exactly. The bank will probably call the note, or try to work something out. There might be a foreclosure process, or a forced sale of whatever he does actually own outright, which isn't much beyond his life estate and some equipment. I haven't gotten that far in my own thinking. I've mostly been trying to make sure the truth gets on the record before anybody makes it worse. You're not going to help him, Lindsay said. It wasn't quite a question. I thought carefully before I answered. I owed her an honest one. I'm not going to lie for him, I said. I'm not going to pretend a life estate is full ownership just because it would be easier on everyone if it were, but I haven't decided yet what happens after the truth comes out. That's a different question than whether I tell it. Lindsay nodded slowly. Then she said something I hadn't expected from her. Not in all the years I'd known her as the golden child, the one who never had to notice the load-bearing walls because somebody else was always holding them up. I always figured you resented me, she said, for leaving, for getting the easy version of this family. I never once thought about what it must have looked like from where you were standing, watching me get handed things I never worked for. I did resent you, I said plainly. There was no point pretending otherwise anymore. For a long time. I'm working on it. I'm sorry, she said. It came out smaller than I expected from her, less polished than her usual apologies. Those ones always arrived wrapped in enough charm you almost forgot to check whether they meant anything. This one didn't have any charm in it at all. It just sat there on the table between us, plain and a little embarrassed of itself. I didn't tell her everything would be fine. I didn't think it would be, not entirely, not for our father. I wasn't going to promise her a softness I couldn't actually deliver. But I told her I was glad she'd finally read the whole deed instead of just the summary she'd been handed. I told her whatever came next, I didn't want it to end this way. Not the way it ended with our father and the truth. 11 years buried under a page nobody bothered to read all the way through. She left a little after 10. I stood on my porch and watched her taillights disappear down Reedy Fork Road. I thought about my grandfather's coffee tin sitting on my kitchen counter, the bent nails inside it, the small, unglamorous evidence of a man who fixed what he could reach and quietly prepared for what he couldn't. The 2 days before the closing passed the way the last hours, before any reckoning pass, too slow and too fast at once. I went to the recorder's office one final time to make certain my certified copies were current and properly sealed. Glenda Voss, seeing me come through the door a third time, simply pulled the file without my having to ask. "Big day coming," she said. It wasn't a question either. 2 days, I said. "You want my honest opinion?" Glenda said, sliding the certified copies across the counter in a fresh folder. "The ones who come back calm. The way you've come back every time. They usually walk out the other side all right. It's the ones who come in yelling the first time that make a mess of it." I thanked her. I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat. I called Ruth Anders to confirm she'd still be there Thursday morning. Ruth said she'd already told her nephew to run the feed store counter without her for the day. Some things matter more than £50 bags of feed, she said, and this was one of them. I did not call my father again before the closing. I did not warn him a third time. I had said what I could say in a kitchen over pot roast and forgotten tomatoes. Standing in my kitchen that night before, I understood something. Whatever happened next in that conference room, I could no longer soften it for him, only something I could witness honestly, the way my grandfather had clearly intended someone to witness it. 11 years before either of us understood the exact shape the morning would take. The night before the closing, I couldn't sleep. I got up around 2 in the morning, made coffee I didn't need, sat at the kitchen table with my grandfather's coffee tin in front of me, turning it slowly under the light. I thought about the first time he let me help with the books. I was maybe 12. He handed me a stack of grain receipts, a calculator that still had a roll of paper tape in it, the kind that spits out a running total you can hold in your hand. "Add these twice," he told me, "once fast, once slow. If they don't match, you did one of them wrong. You don't get to guess which. I did them twice that day. They matched." He nodded once like that settled something important about who I'd turn out to be. I didn't understand at 12 that he was teaching me more than arithmetic. He was teaching me that carefulness was a kind of love, the only kind he really knew how to give. My father never learned that lesson the same way. He learned a different one, from a father who worked before light to after dark and rarely said a soft word out loud. My father grew up believing love had to be proven through providing, through building, through handing his children something bigger than what he'd started with. He measured his worth as a father in acreage and account balances. When the numbers started slipping 2 years ago, some part of him must have panicked. Panicked in a way that made handing Lindsay a clean deed feel like rescue instead of theft. I don't say that to excuse him. I say it because understanding a person's fear doesn't require you to hand him your own inheritance to calm it. Around 3 that morning, I opened the fireproof box one more time, read my grandfather's letter again, though I knew every line of it by heart by then. Don't wave this around. Use it when you need it, and not one day before. I thought about all the ways I could have used it earlier. I could have shown it to my father at the kitchen table, quietly, and spared us both the coming morning. I could have handed it to Lindsay the day she called about the closing. Let her decide for herself whether to walk into that bank at all. I turned each option over in the dark, the way Ruth Anders turns a difficult account over in her ledger. Patient, unhurried, looking for the entry that actually balanced. I kept arriving at the same answer. My grandfather hadn't built a floor under me so I could quietly rescue my father from his own fear. He'd built it so the reckoning would be undeniable. Witnessed. Recorded in a way nobody could later argue away over Sunday dinner. A private warning would have protected my father's comfort. It would not have protected the truth. I put the letter away around 4. I lay back down. I didn't really sleep, just rested with my eyes closed. Listened to the house creak the way old houses do in the last cold hour before dawn. At 6, I got up for good, showered, dressed plainly, the way I dressed for the co-op or the elevator. I didn't want to walk into that bank looking like a woman who'd come to make a scene. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, somebody who kept the books. I made one phone call before I left. To Priscilla Combs, the real estate attorney Ruth had recommended weeks earlier. I hadn't retained her yet. I only wanted to ask one question. If the bank's own attorney confirms the remainder interest today, I asked her, what happens next? Procedurally, I want to understand the shape of it before I walk in. Priscilla walked me through it plainly. The bank would likely halt funding. Title would need a formal review, possibly a quiet title action to resolve the record cleanly. My father's remaining rights would be limited to whatever his life estate allowed, use of the property and its income during his lifetime. Nothing more. The balloon note itself was a separate problem entirely, one that would need its own negotiation with the bank, regardless of how the title issue resolved. You're not obligated to fix his balloon note, Priscilla told me. That's his debt, not yours. What you do next, whether you help him or not, that's a personal decision, not a legal one. I thanked her, told her I'd likely call again that afternoon, once I knew how the morning had gone. I hung up, stood in my kitchen a moment longer. I thought about how strange it was. The law could tell me exactly what I was allowed to do, nothing at all about what I should. 3 days before the closing, I drove out to see my grandfather's grave. I hadn't done that in longer than I liked to admit. The cemetery sat behind the Stony Creek Methodist Church, a small plot under 2 old oaks. The Holloway stones lined up in a row, going back 4 generations. My grandfather's marker was plain granite. His name, his dates. One line underneath that I'd chosen myself the week we buried him. He kept good books. I stood there a while in the cold, coat pulled tight. I told him out loud what I was about to do. I don't know if I believed he could hear me. I think I mostly needed to say it to someone who wouldn't try to talk me out of it, or into it. I'm going to let it happen at the bank, I said. I'm going to let Dad walk in and sign what he thinks is a clean deal. I'm going to let a stranger read your paper out loud instead of telling him myself. I hope that's what you meant for me to do with it. I hope I'm not just being cruel and calling it patience. The wind moved through the oaks. A few dry leaves came down. Nothing about the moment answered me directly, the way nothing ever does at a grave. But I thought about the coffee tin, the bent nails, the way he used to make me add every column twice, once fast and once slow. I understood standing there that he'd already answered the question, long before I ever asked it. He'd answered it the day he filed that second page at the recorder's office, instead of simply telling my father, to be fair. Some lessons he seemed to be telling me from underneath that granite only hold if the person learning them has to feel the floor first, before they understand it was there. I drove home past the co-op, past the elevator where Curtis Beale was probably closing up for the evening, past the turn for Ruth's feed store. I felt something settle in me, resolve without satisfaction, a willingness to do a hard thing without any of the appetite people sometimes assume revenge requires. I didn't want to watch my father humbled. I wanted the truth on the record. Somewhere on that drive, I made my peace with the fact that those 2 things were about to happen in the same room, at the same time, whether I wanted them tangled together or not. 2 days before the scheduled closing, Patricia Renfro called me directly, which surprised me. She had no reason to know I was anything more than a name on a title report she'd probably barely glanced at. "Ms. Holloway," she said, "there's something I should tell you before Thursday." I sat very still at my desk. "All right. Our internal file has a flag on it," she said. "Not a formal hold, just a note from our compliance analyst asking for a second look at the chain of title before funding. I don't know the specifics. I only know it exists. Given the family relationship here, I thought you'd want to know before you walked into that room." I asked her why she was telling me, and not my father, the actual borrower. "Because your name came up in the flag," Patricia said. "Not as a borrower. As a name in the historical record. I don't fully understand why yet. I just know it's there. I don't like closings where somebody in the room knows more than the bank does." I thanked her, told her I appreciated her candour. I hung up and sat a long moment, turning that conversation over the same way I'd turned over Curtis Beale's phone call 2 weeks earlier. I understood something, more clearly than I had at any point up to then. I was no longer the only careful person watching this transaction. The bank itself, in its own slow institutional way, had started asking the same question I'd been sitting on for 3 weeks. I called Priscilla Combs that same afternoon, told her about the compliance flag. She listened. Then she said something that stuck with me the rest of that week. "Dana," she said, "once an institution starts asking its own questions, the outcome stops being entirely yours to control. You can still choose how you show up in that room. You can't choose anymore whether the truth comes out. It's already moving on its own." I thought about my grandfather's coffee tin, the bent nails inside it. Small, useless things he'd kept for reasons nobody but him had ever fully understood. The way some truths sit quiet for years, until the moment they simply can't be kept quiet any longer. I'd spent 3 weeks treating this reckoning as something I alone was building toward. 2 days before it happened, I learned it had its own momentum, entirely apart from me. That night I called Lindsay, mostly because I didn't want her walking into Thursday any less prepared than the bank itself apparently was. "There's a compliance flag on the file," I told her. "I don't know exactly what it means yet. I think it means the bank already suspects something's off with the title, even before I say a word." "Is that good or bad?" Lindsay asked. I could hear, underneath the question, how tired she'd grown of not understanding the shape of her own family's finances. "I think it's neither," I said. "I think it means Thursday's going to be more complicated than any of us planned for. I wanted you to walk in, already knowing that much." She was quiet a moment. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. "Even the part you don't fully understand yet." I hung up that night feeling something I hadn't expected, with the closing so close. Something almost like relief. Not because the outcome had gotten easier to predict, because I was no longer the only person in my family carrying the weight of not knowing what Thursday would bring. Lindsay called me at 7 that same morning, before either of us had left for the bank. "I couldn't sleep either," she said, when I picked up. "I kept thinking about what Priscilla told you, about the outcome not being anybody's to control anymore. I've been thinking about that too," I said. "Are you scared?" she asked, and I could hear, underneath the question, that she was really asking about herself as much as about me. I thought about it honestly before I answered. "A little," I said. "Not of the truth coming out. I've made my peace with that part. I think I'm scared of watching Dad's face when it does. I've never actually wanted to hurt him, Lindsay. I just couldn't keep protecting him from something that was never mine to hide." "I don't think you're hurting him," Lindsay said slowly, like she was working the thought out as she spoke it. "I think whatever's about to happen, he built the room himself. You're just the one who happened to be standing there when the door finally opened." I didn't say anything for a moment. It was, I thought, the most clear-eyed thing my sister had said about our family in longer than I could remember. "I'll see you there," she said. 9:45. "I'm not going to be late for this one." I told her I'd see her there too. We hung up. I sat at my kitchen table a few minutes longer, coffee going cold, thinking about how strange it was. The two of us, after everything, walking toward the same hard morning side by side. Not from opposite ends of the family, the way we always had before. The morning of the closing, before I left the house, I made one more stop. I drove past my old grade school, the one on the edge of town. My grandfather used to pick me up some Fridays when my parents were both working late. He'd take me to the diner on Main Street, or night once each way, order me a grilled cheese, himself black coffee. Ask me every single time the same question. "What did you catch today?" I didn't understand the question when I was 7. I thought he meant fish or frogs, something a kid catches in a creek. By the time I was 10, I understood he meant something else. He wanted to know what I'd noticed, what small true thing had crossed my path that other people walked right past. I used to tell him about a substitute teacher who wrote the date wrong on the board 3 days running, and nobody corrected her. About a boy in my class who always had the exact same lunch money, down to the penny, because his mother counted coins into a sandwich bag every morning. Small things, unimportant things, most people would say. My grandfather never once told me they were unimportant. "You've got the eye," he told me once, when I was maybe 11, sliding my empty plate aside. "Most people go through a whole day and catch nothing. You're already catching things by breakfast." I thought about that diner and that question, driving past the school that morning. On my way to a bank closing that was going to detonate my own father's plans, I understood, maybe for the first time all the way through, something important. My grandfather hadn't started building the floor under me 11 years before the tailgate. He'd started decades before that. Over grilled cheese and black coffee. Teaching a girl who didn't know she needed it that noticing things was a kind of power nobody could take from her later. I sat in my truck outside that school longer than I needed to, watching kids file in through the front doors, backpacks half their size. I thought about what I would catch that day, the way my grandfather always asked. I already knew the answer. I was going to catch my father in a room full of strangers, saying something true he'd spent 30 years not saying to himself. It wasn't a comfortable thing to know, on my way to do it. But it felt, sitting there in the cold, the school bell ringing faintly through my rolled-up window, like exactly the kind of catch he'd always meant for me to bring home. Thursday morning came in grey and still, the kind of Indiana October sky that can't decide between rain and simply staying overcast out of spite. I stopped by the recorder's office one last time on my way. Not because I needed anything else from Glenda Voss. Some instinct told me to be near that building one more time before the morning tipped over into whatever it was going to become. Glenda saw me through the glass, raised 2 fingers off the counter in a small wave, the gesture of someone who already knew, without needing to be told, exactly where I was headed. The Farmers and Merchants Bank branch on Walnut Street sat between a hardware store and a shuttered diner. Brick the colour of dried blood, a flag out front hanging limp in the still air. I parked in the side lot at 20 minutes to 10. Sat in my truck a moment with the folder on the passenger seat. My grandfather's letter tucked inside. I said out loud to nobody, the thing I'd been telling myself for 3 weeks. I don't get loud, I get it recorded. Ruth Anders was already in the lobby, sitting by the front window in her good wool coat, a folder of her own under one arm, which she later told me held nothing more than a handful of old photographs of my grandfather, brought along in her words, in case anybody in that room needed reminding who'd started all of this. "You look steady," Ruth said by way of greeting. "I don't feel steady," I said. "Doesn't matter," she said. "Steady's a performance, same as anything else. You'll manage it fine." My father arrived at 5 minutes to 10, his one good sport coat, the same one for funerals and bank meetings. Both in his private accounting, requiring roughly the same posture. Lindsay came in behind him, dressed more plainly than I'd seen her in years. No blazer at all, just a plain sweater and jeans, as if some part of her had decided, without discussing it with anyone, that today called for less armour. My father saw me across the lobby and stopped mid-step. "Dana," he said, "I didn't expect you here." "I had some things to bring by the bank," I said. True in every particular, misleading in every way that mattered most. His eyes moved to Ruth. Something flickered across his face. Not quite alarm yet, just the first shadow of it. The look of a man beginning to suspect something, that a morning planned down to the signature line had already slipped its rails. "Ruth," he said, "good to see you." "Wade," she said. Nothing more. The single flat syllable of his own name carried more weight in that lobby than a full paragraph would have managed. A young woman from the front desk led us upstairs to a conference room on the 2nd floor. Long table, an untouched coffee service, a window overlooking a parking lot half full of pickup trucks. We were joined by Patricia Renfro, the loan officer, and Harlan Pruitt, the bank's attorney. Tall, thin, a leather folder. The unhurried manner of a man who'd closed 1,000 of these. He expected this one to be just as routine as the last 999. I sat near the end of the table, my own folder closed in my lap. I watched my father settle into his chair. Studied calm. A man trying hard to look like someone with nothing left to worry about. Harlan Pruitt began the way these things always begin, reading through terms nobody in the room was actually listening to closely. The refinance amount, the new interest rate, the repayment term, the collateral description running in flat legal language across a full paragraph. 200 acres more or less in Delaware County, Indiana. The same real estate conveyed to Lindsay Ann Holloway by deed recorded in Deed Book 219, page 44. My father signed the loan application without reading past the first page, the particular signature of a man who's already convinced himself he understands every word underneath it. Lindsay signed next. Her pen hesitated a half-second too long over the collateral line. Her eyes found mine across the table before she signed anyway. Some habits, I understood watching her, take longer than a month to unlearn. I sat with my folder closed and let it happen. Every instinct I had wanted to reach across that table and stop the signatures before they finished landing. I did not. My grandfather had spent 11 careful years arranging exactly this room, Exactly this audience, for the truth to finally surface. Stopping it early would only teach my father one more time that someone more careful than him would always step in before the real cost reached his door. Harlan Pruitt reached the title section. Before we finalise funding, he said, flat, the tone of a man who's read this paragraph 10,000 times. The bank requires confirmation of clear and unencumbered title. Miss Renfro, has the title search come back? Patricia Renfro slid a document across the table. A preliminary title report from a company 2 counties over. The same firm whose folder I'd once glimpsed on my father's desk. Clear, she said. No liens, no judgments, no competing ownership interests on record as of the search date. I glanced at the date at the bottom of that report, 3 weeks earlier. Before my first visit to Glen DeVos's counter, before either certified copy, now sitting closed in the folder on my lap, had been pulled and sealed, this was the moment. I understood it the same way I understood, in the middle of a long silence at Ruth's counter, exactly when it was time to speak. Actually, I said, I don't think that's accurate. Every head at that table turned toward me. My father's face moved through something complicated in the space of a single breath, surprise curdling almost instantly into wariness, the particular look of a man realising all at once that his daughter knows something he does not. Dana, he said carefully, what are you talking about? I opened the folder in my lap, set the 2 certified copies on the table, slid them toward Harlan Pruitt rather than toward my father. Some part of me understood, even then, that the truth would land harder from him, harder than it ever would coming from me. There's a reservation of life estate and remainder interest recorded on this parcel, I said. Deed Book 214, page 88, filed the same day as the original deed from Earl Holloway to Wade Holloway, 11 years ago. It splits the ownership. My father holds a life estate. The remainder interest, the actual ownership that survives his lifetime, was conveyed separately. Harlan Pruitt picked up the document, read it the same careful way Glen DeVos had read it weeks before. Once quickly, then a second time slower, to make certain he'd understood it correctly. To whom? He asked. By the tone of his voice, I think he'd already half guessed. To me, I said. Dana Margaret Holloway. It's right there on the page. The conference room went very quiet. My father's face had gone a pale I'd never seen on him before. Not even at my grandfather's funeral. The pale that comes from watching a plan collapse in real time, in front of the exact audience you built the plan to impress. That's not possible, he said. That deed is 30 years old. I've had that property my whole adult life. You've had a life estate in the property your whole adult life, I said as gently as I could manage. The remainder was always separate. Grandpa recorded it 11 years ago. I only found out myself 3 weeks ago. Harlan Pruitt set the document down, looked at Patricia Renfro. Some silent professional understanding passed between them. The look of 2 people who'd both just watched a routine closing turn into something considerably more complicated. This changes the title analysis significantly, Pruitt said, to the room in general, though I believe he was really speaking to my father. If this remainder interest is validly recorded, and I have no immediate reason to doubt it, then the grantor, in your recent deed, only held a life estate. He could convey his life estate to his daughter Lindsay. He could not convey the remainder, because he never held it in the first place. Meaning what? Lindsay said, speaking for the first time since she'd signed the application. Her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. Meaning the deed to you only transferred your father's life estate interest, Pruitt said, which terminates on his death. It did not, and legally could not, transfer full ownership, because full ownership was never his to give. The remainder belongs to your sister, has belonged to her on the public record since before either of you were fully grown. My father found his voice before Lindsay found hers. This is insane, he said. My own father wouldn't have done this without telling me. He told me, I said quietly. He just didn't tell you. Why, my father said. For the first time in longer than I could remember, he sounded different. Less like a man defending a plan, more like a man genuinely asking a question he needed answered. Why would he do that to me? I thought about Ruth's words in the feed store, about a man who never quite learned the difference between loving somebody and needing somebody to need him. I thought about my grandfather's letter, folded away in the fireproof box at home. I didn't repeat either of those things out loud yet. Not in front of the bank's attorney, and a loan officer with no stake in the answer. I think he was trying to make sure somebody would still be standing on this ground, I said instead, no matter what happened to the rest of it. I don't think it was about you at all, Dad. I think it was about making sure the land outlived whatever any of us did with it. Ruth Anders, silent until that moment, finally spoke. Her voice carried the particular calm of someone who'd waited a long time to say something true. Earl Holloway spent the last years of his life making sure this exact morning would go a certain way, Wade, she said. He didn't do it out of spite. He did it because he loved this girl. He knew a day like this one was coming. You ought to be grateful somebody in this family thought that far ahead, instead of standing there looking robbed. My father didn't answer her. He sat very still, staring at the certified copy on the table, at his own father's careful handwriting on the recording stamp. I watched something in him give way, not into anger exactly, into a kind of exhausted recognition, the look of a man finally setting down a weight he'd carried so long he'd half forgotten it wasn't part of his own body. Harlan Pruitt cleared his throat, the sound of a professional steering the room back to business. Given this discovery, the bank cannot proceed with funding today, he said. We'll need to suspend the closing pending a full title review. Most likely a quiet title action to formally resolve the competing interests now on record. What happens to the loan? My father asked. Underneath the question, I heard the real fear driving him for months. The balloon payment now less than 4 weeks away. No refinance standing behind it. That, Patricia Renfro said carefully, is a conversation we'll need to have separately. About the underlying note. And about the grain advance Mr. Beale's elevator dispersed against a crop on this same parcel. Our compliance department will need to review that contract too, given what's just come to light. My father's head came up sharply. How do you know about the grain contract? He said. He'd assumed that piece of trouble was still safely contained. Word travels through a county records office faster than people expect, Patricia said, not unkindly. Once a remainder interest search starts pinging the system, it tends to surface other filings tied to the same parcel. Nobody hid anything from you today, but the compliance flag has been sitting on this file about 2 weeks. I looked at Ruth. I remembered what she'd told me on the phone, about her friend at the assessor's office. Word travels slow in a place this size, but it travels all the same. I understood then. The reckoning hadn't depended entirely on my own careful timing. The truth, once it existed on the record, had a way of finding its own path toward daylight, with or without my help. My father looked at me across that long table. For a moment I watched 30 years of assumed comfort drain out of his face, replaced by something rawer and more honest than I'd seen from him in longer than I could remember. You knew this whole time, he said. You let me walk in here today. I found out 3 weeks ago, I said. I could have told you privately, and I thought about it every single day since. But you told me standing in our own gravel driveway that I didn't deserve a single acre of this farm. I decided you needed to hear the truth in a room where you couldn't simply talk your way past it, the way you've talked your way past every hard thing for as long as I can remember. He flinched at that, a small motion, barely visible. I saw it. Some old tired part of me almost regretted saying it out loud in front of strangers. I didn't take it back. You don't deserve a single acre of it, he'd said, in the gravel, laughing. I let the words sit in that conference room exactly as long as they needed to. Then I let them go. The closing ended without funding. Harlan Pruitt gathered his papers. Made a note about a follow-up call regarding the title dispute. Offered my father a card for a real estate attorney the bank sometimes recommended. Delivered with the practiced neutrality of a man who'd seen families come apart at that same table more times than he cared to count. We left the bank in near silence. The four of us and Ruth moving across the parking lot under a sky that had finally decided on rain. Fine and cold and steady. My father walked several paces ahead of Lindsay and me, his shoulders set in a way I hadn't seen since my grandfather's funeral, a posture I recognised, uncomfortably, as grief, though I understood it would take him longer than an afternoon to name it that way himself. Lindsay stopped beside my truck instead of following him to his. What happens now, she asked, to him, to the farm? I don't fully know yet, I said, honestly. The bank will sort out the note one way or another. There might be a foreclosure process on whatever he does own outright, or a forced sale, or the compliance people might find a way to restructure things once the dust settles. I haven't gotten that far. And your part, Lindsay asked. The remainder interest. What do you do with that? I looked past her, toward our father's truck, where he sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine, both hands still on the wheel, staring straight ahead at nothing in particular. I don't know that yet either, I said. I know the land is mine on paper now. In a way, it apparently always was. I'm not interested in punishing him the rest of his life. Not over one bad year, stacked on 10 quiet years of favouring you over me. I'm just tired, Lindsay. Tired in a way that's going to take a while to work itself out. She nodded. For the first time in longer than either of us could probably measure, she reached out and hugged me. Quick. A little awkward, the hug of someone out of practice at meaning it, but meaning it all the same. I drove home alone that afternoon in the rain, past the co-op, past the turn for the feed store, past the courthouse annex where Glenda Voss was probably still working the counter, patient as ever, waiting for the next family to walk in, asking her to read them a truth they weren't quite ready to hear. I thought about my grandfather's letter, about the words he'd chosen so carefully, 11 years before any of us needed them. The dirt remembers who works it. Now you have the paper that says so too. I understood, driving those wet 2-lane roads back toward Reedy Fork, that the paper had done exactly what he built it to do. What happened next between my father and me, between Lindsay and me, was going to take longer than a deed could settle. The 200 acres sat quiet and rain-soaked at the end of that gravel road, waiting on a more human accounting than any paper could give it. The weeks after the closing moved slower than the weeks before it. The particular slowness of consequences working themselves out through paperwork instead of drama. The bank's compliance department confirmed within 10 days what Patricia Renfro had already suspected. The grain advance was voided, unenforceable against a life estate holder, pledging land he didn't have full authority to commit. My father owed the $60,000 back regardless, a debt that had nothing to do with title, everything to do with a signature he'd put on paper in good faith, however shaky the ground under that faith turned out to be. The balloon note came due 11 days after that, no refinance behind it. Some part of me expected to feel nothing, some clean, satisfying justice landing where it belonged. I didn't feel that. I felt sick most mornings for 2 weeks, the particular sickness of watching a parent's carelessness catch up to him in a way no carefulness of mine could soften. But I also understood, more clearly each day, that softening it further would only teach him the same old lesson. The 130 years of my own quiet corrections had already taught him without either of us realising. That someone else would always be there to catch the fall before it truly landed. I met with a real estate attorney of my own, Priscilla Combs, careful and unhurried, out of Muncie. Together we worked out what the law actually allowed, now that the remainder interest was confirmed and undisputed on the record. My father's life estate entitled him to use the property, and any income from it for the rest of his life. It did not entitle him to mortgage it, sell it, or pledge it as collateral without my consent. Any encumbrance he created could only bind his own life estate, not the underlying land itself. We came to an arrangement, my father and I, in Priscilla's office on a Tuesday afternoon. The two of us alone for the first time since the tailgate morning 6 weeks earlier. He looked smaller across that table than I remembered him looking my whole life. Not physically, some quieter way. A man who'd finally run out of room to manoeuvre around a truth instead of through it. I'm not going to fight the remainder interest, he said. Priscilla's already told me there isn't a fight to be had. I just want to understand what happens to me now. I told him what Priscilla and I had worked out. He could keep his life estate, keep living in the house, keep whatever comfort the arrangement could still afford him. But the farming operation itself, that would sit with me going forward. What got planted? What got sold? What debt got taken on against the land's future? Formalised in writing, reviewed by an attorney, recorded where it needed to be recorded. You're taking it from me, he said. There wasn't much fight left in the words, more exhaustion than accusation. I'm not taking anything that wasn't already mine, I said. I'm just done pretending it wasn't, for both our sakes. He was quiet a long moment. Your grandfather really planned all this, he said. 11 years ago. He planned for a day when somebody in this family might need a floor, I said. One nobody could sell out from under her. I don't think he was planning against you specifically. I think he was planning for me, the same way you always told yourself you were planning for Lindsay. He just did it quietly enough that it actually held. My father looked at his hands a while before he spoke again. I don't know how to be the kind of father who admits he was wrong, he said. I never learned that from my own father. Earl wasn't exactly free with apologies either. He left you a farm and a letter, and 11 years of silence, I said. Maybe that was his version of one. We didn't resolve everything in Priscilla's office that afternoon. I don't think either of us expected to. But something between us shifted a degree. The way a fence post shifts after years of frost heave. Not falling over, just settling into a new, slightly more honest lean. Lindsay and I talked more in the weeks after the closing than we had in the previous 5 years combined. She moved back to Stony Creek the following spring. Not to the farm itself, but to a small rental in town, close enough to visit without the weight of living under our father's roof. She got a job doing the books for the hardware store, 2 doors down from Ruth's feed store. Work she'd never had reason to learn before. Work she turned out to be quietly good at, once somebody finally gave her the chance to be useful instead of simply favoured. I used to think being loved and being needed were the same thing, she told me one evening. The two of us on my porch, coffee going cold in our hands. Dad needed me to be the easy one. I thought that was love. It took me 31 years and a bank closing to figure out it was mostly just convenient for him. It took me the same 31 years, I said, to figure out being useful, and being loved weren't the same thing either. We both got a version of the same lie, Lindsay. Just opposite sides of it. She reached over and squeezed my hand. We sat there a while longer, watching the light go gold and then grey over the bottoms. The same ground our grandfather had walked in hip waders during the flood year. The same ground he'd quietly protected 11 years before. Either granddaughter understood there was anything worth protecting. Ruth Anders came out to the farm most Sunday afternoons that first year, bringing tomatoes from her own garden. My father's forgotten bag had finally spoiled on my counter. I'd never had the heart to throw the memory of it away, along with the fruit. She'd sit on the porch with Lindsay and me, telling stories about my grandfather neither of us had heard before. Small, ordinary stories about a careful man. He fixed fences before they fell. He filed paperwork nobody thought to ask about, until it mattered more than anything else in the world. I hired Aaron and Cassandra Whitfield the following spring, a young couple renting another man's ground 2 counties over, saving toward land of their own. Long on work, short on capital. The exact kind of people my grandfather would have recognised instantly as worth betting on. I leased them the bottoms on fair terms, recorded properly at the courthouse. Their names sit clean and legal beside mine, on a document that owed nothing to anyone's favour. Everything to an honest accounting of what a fair arrangement actually looked like. My father still lives in the house at the end of Reedy Fork Road. In the life estate my grandfather carved out for him, 11 years before any of us understood what that meant. He and I talk most days now, mostly ordinary things. The weather, a fence that needs mending. Whether the corn will come in ahead of the first frost. We don't talk much about the closing anymore. Or the deed, or the 6 weeks that nearly took the whole operation down with it. Some things I've learned don't need to be revisited once the paper's finally settled where it belongs. I want to tell you about the day I met Aaron and Cassandra Whitfield. I think it says more about what my grandfather built than the closing table ever could. They came out to the farm on a Saturday in March. A beat-up flatbed truck, a dog crate strapped in the bed, a folder tucked under Aaron's arm, the kind a young couple carries once enough landowners have turned them down. Cassandra did most of the talking, quick and precise about acreage and rotation, about what they'd need for drainage on the low ground. I recognised in her, almost immediately, the same carefulness I'd spent 10 years cultivating in myself out of necessity. Not choice. We've been renting 40 acres off a man 2 counties over, Aaron said. He's decent enough, but he keeps the good ground for himself. Rents out what floods every 3rd spring. We've been saving 3 years for something better. How much have you saved? I asked. Not to embarrass them. My grandfather taught me the real conversation always happens in specific numbers, not vague hopes. $11,000, Cassandra said without flinching. The number offered plainly, the way you offer a fact you're not ashamed of. It's not enough to buy anything decent around here. We know that. We're not asking to buy. We're asking to rent fair, prove ourselves. Maybe talk about something longer down the road. I walked them down to the bottoms myself. Past the barn my grandfather built with 2 other men and a case of nails, back in 1961. Past the gravel turnaround where my father once told me I didn't deserve a single acre of any of it. The ground was still cold, but you could see even in March, the particular richness of soil that floods just enough to renew itself without drowning what's planted in it. This is the good ground, I told them. It floods some springs. It doesn't flood others. When it doesn't, it grows the best corn in the township. My grandfather used to say the ground that gives you trouble sometimes is the ground that's paying attention. Aaron laughed at that, an easy, surprised laugh. The laugh of a man who hadn't expected poetry. Not from a woman he'd been told through the co-op grapevine ran her books tighter than the bank itself. Sounds like a man worth learning from, he said. He was, I said. He's the reason I can offer you this ground fair instead of desperate. I want you to know that going in. It matters to how I intend to run things. We worked out the lease over the following 2 weeks. Priscilla Combs drafted the paperwork the same careful way she'd helped me draft the arrangement with my father. 3 years, renewable. A rent figure that left them room to build equity, not just tread water. A first right of refusal, if I ever decided to sell any portion of the bottoms outright. Cassandra cried a little when she signed it, quick and embarrassed, wiping her eyes with the back of her wrist before apologising for something she didn't need to apologise for. Nobody's ever just given us a fair chance without an angle, she said. Feels strange is all. There's an angle, I told her. I want this ground worked by people who'll actually show up to it. That's the whole angle. My grandfather built a version of that same deal for me, 11 years before I understood I'd need it. I'm just passing the shape of it forward. That lease got recorded at the same courthouse annex where Glenda Voss still worked the counter 3 days a week. When I brought the paperwork in to file it, she read the names on the grantee line, looked up over her reading glasses, allowed herself the closest thing to a smile I'd seen from her in all my visits. Whitfield, she said. Good name, steady sounding. They're good people, I said. Hard-working, saved $11,000 renting somebody else's flood ground for 3 years. That'll do, Glenda said, stamping the document. The particular satisfaction of someone who's spent 30 years watching families tear ground apart, finally getting to watch one piece handed forward instead. That'll do just fine. The balloon note situation with my father resolved itself more slowly and less cleanly than the lease with the Whitfields did. Farmers and Merchants Bank, once the compliance review concluded, offered him a restructured note against the equipment and his life estate alone, at a rate considerably less favourable than the refinance he'd been counting on. A life estate carries less collateral value than full ownership. The underwriters explained that to him plainly, with no sympathy for how he'd gotten there. He sold off 2 combines and a grain truck he didn't need to cover the shortfall the restructured note didn't fully address, along with the $60,000 he still owed Curtis Beale's elevator for the voided grain contract. I helped him work out a payment schedule for that debt too, not because I felt obligated to bail him out of a hole his own fear had dug. Watching him those first hard months, I understood something. A man crushed under a debt he can't see past makes worse decisions than a man given an honest, survivable plan. You didn't have to help with this part, he told me, the day we finalised the payment schedule with Curtis over the phone. I know, I said. I'm not doing it to erase what happened at that closing table. I'm doing it because the operation still needs to run. Because Lindsay and I both still need somewhere to come home to that isn't a foreclosure notice taped to the door. He nodded at that, quiet. He didn't try to turn it into more gratitude than I'd offered. There was one more conversation that fall I think about more than almost any other. My father asked me over dinner whether I resented him. The same kitchen table where he'd once told me the deed transfer was just paper. For the 11 years he hadn't known about the remainder interest. For the assumption of full ownership he'd carried his whole adult life without ever questioning it. I don't resent you for not knowing, I said. Grandpa kept it quiet on purpose. I resent you a little for how fast you reached for cruelty in that driveway, before you even knew what you were standing on. That part was yours, not Grandpa's, not the deeds. Yours. He sat with that a long moment, turning his fork over without eating. I was scared, he finally said. Scared men say things they don't mean, trying to protect ground they're about to lose anyway. I know, I said. I forgive the fear. I'm still working on forgiving the cruelty. Those aren't the same thing. I don't think you should expect me to pretend they are just because it would make dinner easier. He didn't argue with that. I think, more than anything else in that whole stretch between the tailgate and the closing table, that dinner was the moment. The moment I understood we might actually find our way to something honest between us. slower than either of us wanted, but real, in a way the family meetings and holiday performances of the previous 10 years had never quite managed to be. I taught Lindsay to read a ledger that winter, sitting at her kitchen table in the little rental 2 doors down from the hardware store, the same way my grandfather taught me. Patient, specific, no shortcuts. You start with the discrepancy, I told her, sliding a stack of invoices across the table. Not the total lies to you. It smooths everything flat. The discrepancy is where the truth is hiding. She frowned at the numbers the way I remembered frowning at them myself. 20 years old, certain the whole exercise was beyond her. How did you learn to see this so fast? She asked. I didn't learn it fast, I said. I learned it slow, over 10 years, mostly because nobody else in the family wanted to do it. So it fell to me by default. You're allowed to learn it slow too. Nobody's timing you. She caught her first real error 3 weeks later. An overcharge on a delivery invoice. $41 a supplier had quietly padded into a bulk order nobody bothered to check line by line. She called me that evening practically breathless with a kind of pride I'd never heard in her voice before. Not about a new dress or a trip, or anything handed to her, about something she'd caught with her own 2 eyes. Unassisted. $41, she said, is not much. But I found it, Dana. Nobody showed me where to look this time. I just looked. That's the whole job, I told her. Most people think it's about big numbers. It's really about noticing $41 when everyone else would let it go. I thought, hanging up the phone that night, about how strange it was, watching my sister discover, in her 30s, the exact, quiet competence I'd spent my whole life building, simply because nobody had ever given her the chance, or the reason, to look for it in herself. I understood finally that our father hadn't just cost me something by favouring her all those years. He'd cost her something too, a different kind of theft. The theft of ever needing to become capable, because someone else had always been capable enough for both of us. Ruth Anders came to the farm one Sunday that same winter. She brought a box of my grandfather's old things, kept in her own attic for years. Things Earl had left with her for safekeeping decades back and simply never asked for. The way old friends sometimes hold onto pieces of each other without either one quite remembering why. Inside the box was a second ledger, older than any I'd ever seen, his handwriting from decades before I was born. Careful columns of seed costs and yields, going back to the year he first took over the farm from his own father. Tucked into the back cover was a folded scrap of paper, brittle with age, handwriting even shakier than the letter in the manila envelope. Started this book the spring I turned 26, it read. Told myself I'd keep it honest even when nobody was checking. 40 years later, still checking myself first. If you're reading this, you already know why that matters more than anything else I could leave you. I sat with that scrap of paper a long while on my porch, the coffee tin beside me, the bent nails rattling faintly whenever I shifted. I understood something about my grandfather I hadn't fully understood before. The 11-year plan wasn't some sudden late-life scheme cooked up by a dying man trying to fix a mistake. It was the same habit he'd practiced his entire adult life, the plain, unglamorous discipline of keeping an honest accounting, whether or not anyone was watching, applied one final time to the one problem he could see coming that none of the rest of us could. Ruth watched me read it, quiet, the way she was quiet at her own counter, waiting for a customer to fill a silence themselves. He was like that his whole life, she said. Never did the loud thing, just did the accurate thing, over and over, until the accurate thing was too solid for anybody to argue with. I don't get loud, I said, half to her, half to the letter in my hands. I get it recorded. Sounds like you already knew that, Ruth said, long before you ever needed it. I kept that old ledger on the shelf in my office at the farm, next to the newer one I kept myself. The discount schedules and grain tickets and lease payments that made up the ordinary daily accounting of 200 acres finally settled where they belonged. Some mornings, before the light was fully up, I'd open it just to look at his handwriting. 40 years of careful columns, proof that the floor he'd built under me in his last years hadn't come from nowhere. It came from a whole lifetime of practicing the same quiet habit, long before anyone in this family needed it to save them. Curtis Beale called me again the following August, a full 10 months after that first uneasy phone call, about the voided grain contract, this time about an entirely ordinary matter. the moisture readings on that season's first load of beans off the bottoms. "Whitfield's brought in a beautiful load," he said. "Best moisture I've seen off that ground in years. Tell them I said so." "I will," I said, and meant it, thinking of Cassandra's careful rotation plan. The drainage work Aaron had put in that spring with his own hands and a rented excavator. The $11,000 they'd saved, renting somebody else's flood ground for 3 patient years, before anyone gave them better. "Funny how a place turns around once the right people are minding it," Curtis said. I could hear in his voice no trace of the wariness from that first difficult call, just the plain satisfaction of a man who deals in grain and weights and settlement checks. Glad to see a parcel finally living up to what the soil had always been capable of. I thought about that phrase the rest of the drive home, the right people minding it. My grandfather understood that 11 years before the rest of us caught up. Land doesn't actually care whose name sits on the deed. It only responds to who shows up, season after season, willing to do the unglamorous work of keeping it honest. My father still struggles with that idea some days. I think he still catches himself measuring his own worth by what he can control rather than what he can steward well. But he shows up now, most mornings, walking the fence line. The way his own father once walked it in hip waders during the flood year, checking on cattle nobody thought could be saved. Some part of him seems to understand, slowly, that the work itself might have been the inheritance all along. The part no deed transfer could ever actually give away or take back. I don't know if my father and I will ever fully close the distance those 10 years of quiet favouritism carved between us. I've stopped expecting a clean, complete resolution, the kind you'd want for a story like this one. Everyone forgiven, everyone healed, the whole ledger balanced to zero. Some debts, I've learned, don't ever fully clear. You just keep making honest payments against them, season after season. The same way my grandfather kept his books honest for 40 years, whether or not anyone else was checking. Glendavos retired from the recorder's office the following spring, 31 years at that same counter. Ruth Anders and I drove into Muncie together for the small reception the county held for her. Cheap sheet cake, lukewarm coffee, a framed certificate nobody would ever hang anywhere important. "You were the one who read it to me first," I told her. "I meant the reservation of life estate, the remainder, interest. 11 years of quiet paper that changed everything, without ever once raising its voice. I don't think I ever properly thanked you for that." "Wasn't anything special," Glenda said. She waved the compliment off the way she waved off most things, practical to the last. "I just read what the page said. You're the one who came back 3 times to make sure you understood it right. That part was yours." I thought about that exchange a long time afterward. The plain, unglamorous truth of it. Nobody had handed me anything I hadn't already earned through 10 years of careful attention. Not even the discovery itself, which had simply been sitting there, patient, in a bound volume on a shelf, waiting for someone careful enough to come looking. That, I've come to believe, is the whole of what my grandfather actually left me. Not the land exactly, though the land matters. Not the paper, though the paper mattered more than almost anything else in this story. He left me the plain, quiet conviction that careful, honest work eventually gets read out loud. By somebody. In some room. On some ordinary Thursday morning. Whether or not the people who doubted you ever expected it to. People in Stony Creek still ask me, sometimes, why I didn't just sell the whole 200 acres once the dust settled. Be done with all of it. The favouritism, the fear, the 11 years of silence my grandfather kept before any of it made sense. I understand why they ask. It would have been simpler. It would have been, in some ways, the version of justice a person expects from a story like this one. A clean severing. A fresh start somewhere the name Holloway didn't carry any weight at all. I never seriously considered it. I think about my grandfather more now than I did in all the years before that October. Not with grief exactly, though there's still some of that mixed in. Something closer to a running conversation, the kind you keep having with a person after they're gone because they left you enough of themselves to keep answering. I think about him every time I sign a lease at the courthouse, every time I catch a discrepancy on a grain ticket, every time somebody in this county assumes the quiet one in the room has nothing worth saying. I used to believe being useful was the only currency I had left to offer my family. That if I was careful enough, patient enough, quiet enough, it would eventually be enough. enough to earn what Lindsay seemed to get simply by being born second, and easier to love out loud. I don't believe that anymore. My grandfather saw the shape of that lie decades before I did. Instead of arguing my father out of it, which he understood would never work, he simply built a floor underneath it. One nobody could sell, mortgage, or laugh away in a gravel driveway. I told my father once, months after the closing, that I didn't deserve a single acre of that farm. I told him I knew now that he'd meant it as a wound, not a fact. Facts, unlike wounds, tend to survive being recorded on paper a lot longer than they survive being spoken out loud in anger. He didn't have much to say to that. I didn't need him to. The mornings are mine now, the way they were always meant to be, according to a man who filed one careful piece of paper 11 years before either of us understood we'd need it. I take my coffee on the porch at the end of reedy fork before the light is fully up. My grandfather's dented tin sits on the rail where I set it down, the day I carried it home out of the machine shed. The bent nails still rattle faintly in the bottom whenever the wind catches the porch just right. I set my coffee cup down beside it. Somewhere out past the bottoms, a tractor turns over, and the ground that remembers who works it gets worked again.